Good morning, everybody. If you're joining us right now, we'll just wait for a second or two to let everybody in, and then we'll get underway. Good morning, everybody. If you're just joining us, we'll just wait for a second or two longer for folks to join us, and then we'll start. All right, I think we're ready to begin. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody this morning, our Canadian International Council members and our guests, and we're happy to have you here today. And for those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of CIC Victoria out here on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Wesley Wark, this morning, and our moderator, Marilyn Denton, who is also a member of our CIC Victoria Executive Committee. And before we do get underway, it's important to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples on whose territories we are meeting today. We are grateful to live here, and we honor the nations who have always and continue to care for these lands and waters. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in the world. What makes us a little different from the many think tanks that are here in Canada is that we have branches across the country. In fact, we have 18 branches with almost 1,400 members. And if you've listened to me before say how many branches we have, it's usually been 17. We now have 18 with the addition of a branch in Barrie. It's centered on Barrie. It's the Simcoe County branch. So we're happy that we've been able to bring in that part of the country to the CIC world. You can find more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council. And if you're not a member of the Canadian International Council, we would really be happy to have you as members of our organization. So please take the time to look at our website if you could. Now, as the event unfolds this morning, the way we're going to do things is Wesley will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. And for that, I just ask that you use the Q&A function that you'll find if you just scroll down to the bottom of the screen. And we're also recording this event this morning. So as mentioned, our moderator is Marilyn Denton, and Marilyn retired in Victoria after 27 years working for the federal government. And Marilyn's final assignment was as Trade Commissioner for Vancouver Island and head of the Victoria Office of Global Affairs Canada. While most of Marilyn's career was spent in Ottawa, she also lived abroad in Pakistan and Jamaica and traveled extensively for work in the Asia-Pacific region. Marilyn has also worked in the private sector on various contracts and was one of two founding staff of the Foundation for Educational Exchange between Canada and the United States of America, the Fulbright Scholarship Program. So Marilyn, thank you for being our moderator today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Chris. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Wesley Wark, who is currently a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, where he is directing a project on reimagining Canadian national security strategy. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa and an instructor at the Centre on Public Management and Policy, where he teaches courses on intelligence and security to government officials. He spent most of his career in academia at the University of Toronto, where he taught from 1988 to 2013. Professor Wark is also the co-editor of a digital essay series published by the Centre for International Governance Innovation, Security Intelligence and the Global Health Crisis. His most recent book is an edited volume, Secret Intelligence, a Reader. He also serves on the editorial advisory board of the journal, Intelligence and National Security, is a former editor of the journal and a frequent media commentator on national security and intelligence issues, appearing before parliamentary committees on numerous occasions. Professor Wark was appointed as a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on National Security for 2 terms, 2005 to 2009, and more recently he was an advisor to the Minister of Public Safety on national security policy and legislation. Now, over to you, Professor Wesley Wark.
Marilyn, thank you so much for that introduction. It was probably longer than it needed to be, but I'm grateful for it. I wanted to thank Chris Kilford as well for the invitation to speak to you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. You'll have gotten used to that refrain by now. I genuinely mean it in terms of Victoria. There's many places that it might just be perfunctory, but it'd be certainly nice to be out on the West Coast at this moment. Ottawa is still under about 10 feet of snow as I speak, although it's beginning to warm up. What I wanted to do today, and Chris had very kindly given me a sort of wide canvas to choose topics about, I thought it might be interesting for everyone to hear a little bit about one of the many threats that impinges on Canada's national security that doesn't get the attention I think that it deserves, at least not the consistent attention, is subject to kind of episodic stories that have a tendency to kind of go away in the public imagination, but it is certainly a persistent threat, and it's certainly a challenge for Canada's security and intelligence community to deal with. So that issue that I want to talk about is something called the insider threat. And the insider threat is exactly what the phrase suggests. It's the threat posed by individuals who work within organizations, usually government organizations, but they can be private contractors as well, who have access to sensitive information and for a variety of often difficult to discern or complex reasons, decide to provide that sensitive information in an unauthorized fashion, of course, to outside entities, foreign governments, bad guys of various kinds. And certainly Canada has been afflicted by the insider threat over the past decade. And I think the danger of the insider threat, for some reasons that I'm going to talk about, is growing. It has certainly been signaled as a threat by the current director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, David Vigneault, who gave a recent speech at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, where he tried to kind of paint a picture of the kinds of threats that his organization is trying to deal with under their mandate. So an insider threat is posed by an insider with access to sensitive information. Part of the reason why insider threats are insidious and growing as a danger is really, I think, twofold. And I'm going to get to the details of some cases in a minute. One is that insiders are just extremely difficult to detect. So they're in your midst. They look like a trusted friend and colleague. They may behave like a trusted friend and colleague, difficult to spot and difficult to, difficult to uncover through the standard kind of security screening or security measures that might be in place. The other phenomenon that makes the insider threat increasingly dangerous is that they really are, as threats, enabled by technology these days. I mean, these are human actors, but enabled by technology. And we can, think back over some sensational cases in Canada's past. We can think of Igor Grzhenko, who was an insider threat for the Russians and who defected to Canada in September 1945. And what Igor Grzhenko brought with him under his shirt as he fled the Russian Soviet at that time embassy was 109 documents. That seemed a remarkable haul at the time, but it's only a fragment of what a current insider could have access to and do damage with. In the classic days of the Cold War, we would have individuals we often referred to as moles, some of the Cambridge Five, for example, who would operate with a Minox camera. And maybe they could, over the course of a career, photographed with those wonderful little German-made miniature cameras, made, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 pages of documents. These days, insiders, using access to the internet computer databases, sensitive computer systems and networks, can access just, tons and tons of material. So the combination of that technologically enabled access and ability to pilfer, huge quantities of information alongside, the essential mysteriousness and often invisibility of the insider compounds the threat. There is a classic formulation to try and understand these insider threats. And in the Cold War, this was an American concept that was spread among US's allies. They were often kind of characterized, these insiders, double agents, traitors, moles, whatever you want to refer to them, under this acronym. It was called MICE, M-I-C-E. And MICE referred to kind of 4 different possible motivations for an insider who wanted to act against his or her country's interests. M stood for money, so essentially greed. I stood for ideology, that is, an insider might be acting out some belief or support for a foreign ideological system. C stood for corruption. In other words, an insider might have found him or herself in a position where, through criminality or blackmail or something like that, they were in a difficult bind and perhaps forced to act even against their will. And E is perhaps the most interesting of all. E stood for ego. That is that kind of psychological complex that might motivate someone to try and be an insider, and believe on top of that they could get away with it. So that MICE formulation, kind of held for the Cold War, was used as a sort of profiling tool to try and understand insiders when they were uncovered and identify them if there was a fear that they were operating in your midst. And it continues to be something of the conventional wisdom around what motivates the insider threat, insider actor. I think the element that has probably gone away the most is the ideological one. We don't see that many insiders acting out of ideological motives these days, post the great contest between international communism and democratic systems during the Cold War. But money, certainly, corruption, certainly, ego, certainly remains part of the equation. So I said that Canada has had its own problems with insider threats. And it seems to me that those problems have, over the past decade, shown themselves to be both very serious and persistent. And they raise questions, frankly, about our ability or inability to deal with the insider threat as a serious security problem. So I want to, in the time available, I want to run through 3 very high profile insider threat cases that have come to our attention through public exposure and generally through judicial processes, which is how we find out about them. The 3 cases are all different. They all probably pose different levels of harm to Canada, but all potentially serious. And they range over the period from 2012 to the present. The first case you may be familiar with is the case of Jeffery Delisle. And I'm just going to summarize these cases as quickly as I can so that we can get through them all and we can have lots of time to discuss and kind of enlarge on whatever might be of interest. So I'll just give you a quick profile of the Delisle case. Jeffery Delisle was a junior military intelligence officer who, just prior to his arrest by the RCMP in January 2012, was working in an intelligence fusion center called HMCS Trinity, which served the Canadian Maritime Command. His history as an insider, or his history as a, if you like, double agent, traitor, mole, whatever you want to say, began in 2007. So arrested in January 2012, but his career actually began in the summer of 2007, when he decided to offer his services to the Russians by taking a relatively short walk from the National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa through a neighborhood called Sandy Hill to the Russian embassy, and where he was interviewed. He said he had information to provide that would be of value. He was interviewed by the Russian military intelligence branch of their intelligence services called the GRU. And after a while the Russians were vetting him and trying to figure out whether he was for real or might have been a provocation by the Canadians, his services, his offer of services, which is a kind of John le Carré phrase, were accepted. He was, in the professional jargon, what's called a walk-in agent. So he operated providing sensitive intelligence that he had access to from the summer of 2007 till December 2011, when he came under intensive scrutiny by the RCMP. How was he caught? He wasn't caught by us over that 4-year period. He was actually caught by the FBI on the basis of intelligence that came to them. The nature of that, we don't know. The FBI then tried to alert its Canadian partners, first CIS's, and then when they felt that CIS's didn't appear to be taking strong action in the case, they turned to the RCMP and provided the RCMP with their kind of file on Delisle in December 2011. The RCMP that went into kind of crisis mode to try and mount intensive surveillance on Delisle and put together information that could be used in a criminal prosecution. Delisle did a lot of damage to Canadian security because of his access. He had a top secret, or what's called TSSI clearance, top secret special information clearance. He had access to special computer databases that provided for the flow of allied intelligence in and out of Canada from our Five Eyes partners. So he was actually a threat both to Canadian security and our ability to protect our own secrets, but he was also a threat to the informational sources and integrity of our Five Eyes, particularly the United States. There are lots of curious stories within this story of Jeffery Delisle. But there was one saving grace at the end of the day for the Canadian government, and that saving grace was that Delisle decided that he would plead guilty. And that saved the government from a court case where a lot of sensitive and embarrassing information might have come out. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment in 2012. He is now completely out of jail. He was deemed a model offender while he was in a high security prison in Nova Scotia. And he was released on the parole board's recommendation after serving 7 years of his 20-year sentence on the grounds, which I always found a little laughable, to be honest, on the grounds that he was unlikely to reoffend. Well, that's certainly the case. He wasn't going to have a future opportunity to reoffend. But Delisle did damage, and one of the things he did damage to, which was pretty unprecedented, was actually to the solidity of Canada's membership in this Five Eyes intelligence partnership. Our Five Eyes partners were very alarmed by the details of the Delisle case, and the United States, one of our, of course, major providers and partners in the Five Eyes, went so far as to threaten Canada with some form of expulsion from the Five Eyes unless it could fix all of the security problems that were revealed by the Delisle case. And they were many. Delisle was, I mean, the two most egregious examples of these security flaws was that Delisle was able to pilfer information from top secret databases for a 4-year period without ever being detected. He was able to remove that information from classified systems onto a thumb drive or a USB key, bring it home, transfer it to his home computer, and then communicate with a sort of electronic Dropbox that the Russians managed for him out of a server in Egypt. He went undetected throughout this entire period. And one of the worst examples of the security problems surrounding this case was that Jeffery Delisle's top secret security clearance actually expired in the latter stages of his spying for the Russians, wasn't renewed, but he wasn't renewed in the sense that they were going through a very slow process of renewing it. But in the meantime, even though his security clearance had expired, he was still provided unimpeded access to these classified systems, including at HMCS Trinity. Anyway, that's the Delisle case. So I'm going to move on because we're short of time. The second case I want to touch on very briefly is I think a case that's less serious in terms of the damage done, but still a very intriguing kind of case. This is the case of a man named Quentin Huang, who was born in China, came to Canada, was an engineer. His case actually dates back to 2013, so he was arrested in 2013, only a year after Delisle was arrested. Like Delisle, Huang was charged under the Security of Information Act, or Official Secrets Act, for leaking classified information in an unauthorized manner. And I said his case started in 2013. It's still going through the courts, and it's hung up in a real legal quagmire. Huang himself was a civilian employee of a subcontractor called Lloyd's Register, very well-known subcontractor, who were involved in aspects of the Navy shipbuilding program for both the frigates and the Arctic patrol vessels. How was he caught? He called up the Chinese embassy in Ottawa and offered information to the Chinese government, which he said would be of interest to them based on his work on the Canadian naval program. That call was monitored by CICs, and the security apparatus then went into action. And at least according to media reports, this hasn't yet been confirmed in the criminal case because we haven't got there yet. According to media reports, on the basis of sort of insider accounts, the RCMP put together a quick sting operation where their officers posed as members of the Chinese Ministry of State Security, MFS, and had Huang essentially confessed to them that he wanted to provide them with information. So this case, quite fascinating. We don't really understand his motivations. There have been suggestions that he perhaps held divided loyalties, was to some extent still drawn to China and the Chinese communist model of governance, seemed to be a disgruntled employee in terms of his concerns about his lack of advancement. Again, media reporting has suggested he wanted to play a bigger role in providing engineering assistance and advice to the naval program, which was denied him. The main thing about this case is really the legal quagmire. It just shows you one of the challenges that are involved in dealing with insider threats, especially when you want to prosecute them. This case has been running for seven years. It's into its 8th year. And Mr. Huang has a very clever lawyer, which, all defendants are eligible to have access to very clever lawyers. And his clever lawyer has mounted what's called a Garofoli defense. And I'm quickly getting beyond my boundaries of expertise, but a Garofoli application is essentially an application to challenge a wiretap on the basis of its validity. So what Mr. Huang's lawyer is trying to do is get access to the CIC's surveillance of the Chinese embassy and the reasons behind it and how it caught Huang in that surveillance and so on. And either with the hope that the information in the CIC's material is not as damning as it appears to be, or perhaps more realistically in the hope that the government will fold its case because it couldn't afford to reveal any of this information in public. So that's where the case is at the moment. It's bounced back between different levels of the court, including the Federal Court of Appeal to the government. There's what's called the Section 38 Canada Evidence Act application applied to the case to prevent the divulging of sensitive information by the Minister of Justice. It is a mess. and who knows how or where or when it will be resolved. And so then the final case that I want to talk about quickly, and I'll do this as fast as we can, is the most recent case. This is a case that you may be more familiar with. It's the case of Cameron Ordus, who was a senior RCMP civilian member who was arrested in September 2019 and again charged under the Security of Information Act. When he was arrested, he was the Director General, which is a fairly senior executive position. He was serving as the Director General of something called the RCMP's National Intelligence Coordination Center, which was designed to be a bit of an RCMP fusion center for dealing with all manner of intelligence that would come to them to assist in their security mandate under the RCMP Act. He became Director General of this National Intelligence Coordination Center in 2016. So he served in that capacity for 3 years until he was arrested. He'd actually joined the RCMP back in 2007, having completed a PhD at UBC, a PhD, interestingly, on cyber threats in the dark web and criminal activity on the dark web. And that was one of the attractions that he held for the RCMP, to try and build up their expertise in that area. Unlike Delisle, and this is also true of Huang, Mr. Ordus shows no sign of being willing to plead guilty to these charges. So we're again faced with a very complex legal proceeding, and it's only at its very beginning. There is no doubt that he probably did very serious damage to Canadian national security in terms of his alleged contacts and efforts to sell information to what appear to be primarily organized crime elements in Canada, the United States, and more globally. He was uncovered as a result of a differently based investigation in the United States into money laundering and organized crime, which led back to an individual in Vancouver by the name of Vincent Ramos, who had made a career out of selling customized BlackBerries crammed with encryption material to organized crime groups so that they could use these customized BlackBerries to evade detection by law enforcement. And the customized BlackBerries were even able to be erased entirely if an individual possessing one of these things from a company called Phantom Secure was arrested. Then Phantom Secure could just erase all the material on the BlackBerry and remove some of the potentially incriminating evidence against it. So this is where we're at with Cameron Ordus. It's been a big shock as a case to the RCMP. Certainly, it was also very damaging for the RCMP's efforts, particularly its efforts to build up a capacity to counter cybercrime, which Ordus was really heading, as well as, of course, the embarrassment this always causes and concerns it always causes to our Five Eyes partners, because Ordus, with his own high-level security clearance, was privy to a lot of Five Eyes intelligence reporting that came to the RCMP. So these are three big cases, and I'm just going to conclude on this point by trying to suggest, where they fit in the framework of our understanding of insider threats. So Delisle, let me start with him, and just again thinking back to this kind of common framework that's often applied to insider threats, the MICE framework: money, ideology, criminality or corruption, ego. Delisle doesn't fit this box very neatly at all. Jeffery Delisle was an individual who was psychologically damaged, primarily by, I think, a combination of his own kind of immaturity and the experiences of going through a very painful divorce. He was a very devoted family man, very devoted to his kids. When he confessed to his RCMP interrogator, he told his RCMP interrogator that he had decided to approach the Russians because he wanted to commit what he called psychological suicide or professional suicide. He wanted just to bring this whole mess of his life to an end, and this is how he thought to do it. when the RCMP arrested him in his driveway in Halifax in January 2012, one of the first things he said to them after he'd been informed about the charges against him, just very briefly, and put in the back of an RCMP cruiser, he said, you know, why did it take you so long? Which kind of indicates something of his state of mind. So he's one of these individuals, which is often true of insiders, which again kind of points to the invisibility problem of them, the difficulty to detect them if you don't have otherwise strong security practices, which Canada certainly didn't have in his case. Quentin Huang, a different kind of character, perhaps impacted by divided loyalties, impacted by career grievances, and somehow the combination of those things was enough to lead him to take the actions that he did in approaching the Chinese. These are never very sort of satisfactory, complete, kind of novelistic explanations of psychological motive, but that's as best we can get with Huang, I think. And then Ortis is perhaps the most mysterious of them all, a kind of golden boy at the RCMP in terms of his career path. Although there were charges, well, allegations brought against him by some of the people that served in his unit on the basis of workplace harassment and other things. But nevertheless, regarded by senior officials at the RCMP as exactly the kind of person they needed to advance the RCMP's ability to deal with cyber issues, cyber crime, cyber espionage, and trying to get prosecutions moving. What motivated Ordus? And where does he fit in the MICE framework? Money might have been an element. He was in debt, though not grievously so. But the debt seems a bit problematic. There may have been a greed factor there. What appears particularly to have motivated Ordus was more that E component of MICE, ego, or in Ordus's case, hubris. There is a pretty good CBC Fifth Estate program that I encourage you to watch on the Ordus case that was done about a year ago or so, I think December 2020, which is entitled The Smartest Man in the Room, which seems to kind of capture Ordus's sense of himself, as well as how he was viewed by his colleagues. So he may have been one of these people who felt that he could simply get away with it, and that it was an interesting kind of game to play, unbeknownst to his masters and you know, the paramilitary officers who lead the RCMP. Perhaps he felt that he was better than them all, and that he could prove this in some way that mattered to him by engaging in this act of treason. But again, it's not a full psychological explanation, and even when these cases go to court and go through lengthy processes, sometimes we never really arrive at an answer about the insider threat and motivations. What we do learn, of course, through these cases is the insider threat is real, and there are really only two defenses for it, and I'll end on this point. One is you know, it's as strong security, internal security measures as you can manage. And the other is really an ability to maintain kind of vigilance in workplaces, which is very, very difficult, because vigilance in workplaces introduces a kind of element of mistrust. And anyone who's worked in government will know just how difficult that is. The automatic assumption is you trust your colleagues, and to kind of to bend that outlook in the interests of security, when security threats may seem unlikely to touch your particular line of work, is a very difficult thing. The government is trying to move in that direction through a 2014 fundamental change to its security procedures within government and within the federal government and its security classifications and so on. But it represents a significant cultural change. There's a lot of other practical things you can do in terms of enhancing security that were pointed out, especially by the Delisle case, and I suspect will also come to the fore as the Ortis case moves through the courts, as slowly as it will bound to do. But I suppose my final message is the insider threat is real. You have to be able to have a strong counterintelligence capacity to monitor for these threats, and there's no perfect defense against them. So you'll always suffer the occasional insider, And I think, in some ways, an important defense against them is actually being able to bring successful prosecutions and to a certain extent hold up those who engage in insider activities to some form of judicial deterrence and public ridicule. Jeffery Delisle came out of his case looking like a man-child fundamentally. And, that may not be an appealing model for others who wanted to follow in his footsteps. Anyway, let me end it there. I've probably gone over time, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Wark. Can you comment on how dependent Canada is on security intelligence from the United States?
Yeah, Marilyn, that's a good question. The loose answer is very dependent. People have tried to put a figure on that dependence, that degree of dependence. Sometimes the figure has gone as high as, and this is not just the US, but in general, our Five Eyes partners and other partners, for example, within NATO that we exchange intelligence with. Sometimes the figure rises to as high as 95% of all the intelligence that is accumulated in the Canadian system. 95% of it may come from outside sources. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration. We do have our own made in Canada capabilities. But I think what's allowed the Canadian system to function well beyond its own resources has been its access for a very, very long period of time to the Five Eyes network in particular, which we joined as the third member in 1949. So we were the first country to expand the framework out beyond its core special relationship between Britain and the United States. So we joined in 1949, and then Australia and New Zealand came in the mid-1950s. So altogether, the Five Eyes has been functioning for a long time. It's changed quite considerably. It began as a forum, if you like, or a partnership for the exchange of signals intelligence. Almost uniquely, now it exchanges many, many forms of intelligence. It shares technological advances. It's even moving into the realm of developing common foreign policy approaches to some key issues, especially driven by concerns about China, lesser extent Russia. So it really has changed over the years, but it's fundamentally important to allowing Canada to have a global sort of sense of threats and a global intelligence capacity, which we've never been willing to build on the basis of our own resources.
Thank you. And looking at the various agencies involved in Canada, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Communications Security Establishment, the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, the RCMP intelligence role, do you see these agencies working well together or stepping on each other's toes, or are you able to comment on how well or not they work together?
I think a lot of lessons have been learned about working well together over the years. Some on the basis of painful experiences. For example, Air India, where CICs and the RCMP certainly did not work well together in their efforts either to prevent that plot or to investigate it afterwards. So there's been a lot of attention to different parts of that kind of complex machinery. The reality in the Canadian system is that we have multiple agencies, probably up to about 18 or so, all with some kind of security and intelligence mandate and some kind of intelligence capabilities, whether assessment or collection or what have you. So it's a big world of different agencies and departments to try and coordinate and make sure they're all working together. Some of them have long and pretty smooth experience of combining forces. I would say that's probably true, particularly for CICs and CSE. Other agencies are new to the business of working in a whole of government fashion, and may have, may still have way to go in trying to do that. We've made efforts to try and improve the governance of national security and intelligence over the years, but that governance system is still pretty loose. We have at the sort of top of the pyramid in Ottawa a National Security and Intelligence Advisor. But interestingly, unlike some of his or her counterparts among the Five Eyes, the NSIA, as he's or she's called, doesn't have any statutory powers. The power that comes to the National Security and Intelligence Advisor is really a result of being, if you like, close to the throne, close to the Prime Minister, being able to convey the Prime Minister's desires to different elements of the security intelligence system. So we have a pretty decentralized system in which we've tried to kind of knit together through various measures, generally through coordinating officials and coordinating committees. But it's a complex piece of governance, I think no one would deny. And generally, we only learn about real problems with regard to cooperation and coordination in the aftermath of the emergence of some scandal or some failure. So that's not very helpful either.
There's a question about Huang's financing of his case. Do you have any idea whether China is providing him with assistance, or is this just a unknown?
It's unknown. So I have no idea beyond the fact that the resources available, certainly on Ontario, where the case is being heard for legal assistance, are pretty minimal. So I presume there is an agreement between Mr. Huang and his legal team about how the costs of that case are going to be recovered. I think it's very unlikely that there's any foreign support, financial support for that case, not least because it would face any lawyer involved in such a case with possible disbarment. So I don't imagine that is the source. Sometimes lawyers take on these cases for the combination of profile and sheer fascination that drive them. So,
right. A question about actions aimed at countering the insider threat likely to produce a chilling effect. For example, whistleblowers working in the public interest and in national security disclosures. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably two different dimensions to this. We have a whistleblower protection regime in Canada in statute regulation that's that I don't think is anybody's kind of dream concept of how you allow authorized whistleblowers to take action. It's a complex system, but basically it's a whistleblower system based on official willingness to allow a whistleblower to whistleblow. I'll put it like that, and happy to kind of expand on that if people really want to. So I think the main thing I would say is the whistleblower protection regime is kind of a bit skewed and is unlikely to provide much comfort to real whistleblowers, and by real whistleblowers, I mean people who believe that they have to provide information to some unauthorized entity, usually the media, in the genuine public interest, because they feel that the public needs to know about something that they believe is unlawful or improper. So that, I think that there's a chilling impact in terms of whistleblowers feeling able to blow the whistle because of the loose nature of our approaches to whistleblowing. And on top of that, if you're trying to protect yourself against insider threats of various kinds, including whistleblowers, as I say, you have to have strong counterintelligence tools. You have to have strong security measures. And what the government came to realize in the aftermath of the Delisle case is that essentially, in the old system that Marilyn and Chris will probably remember, you got a security clearance that was good for a number of years. If it was a secret clearance, it was good for 5 years. It was good for 10 years. If it was a top secret clearance, it was good for 5 years. You didn't have to really do anything in that interval of time to maintain your security clearance. Now, obviously, in a 5 or 10 year period, circumstances can change in an individual's life. And very often, the studies that have been done in Britain and the United States in particular indicate that most insiders become insiders only after they're inside. In other words, they didn't join whatever agency of government or whatever contracting firm they joined with the intention of deliberately leaking information that came to them for complex reasons after they were already on the job. So to make a long story short, what the government did in the aftermath of the Delisle case to try and fix some of the security problems is that it fundamentally revamped its what they call its standard on security screening, which now it tries to build in a system really of constant vigilance, where there are responsibilities on both managers and individuals working in the federal government to report on changes of circumstances or suspicious activities on a constant basis, so that they don't have to wait for these kind of goalpost moments in time to arrive before someone goes through another version of a security clearance.
Thank you. This is a very large question, but maybe you can briefly touch on it. How concerned should we be with foreign intelligence agencies operating in Canada?
Yeah, foreign intelligence agencies are a persistent and big problem. And again, as in the case with insiders, who can sometimes offer their services to foreign intelligence agencies as walk-in agents, the very nature of espionage is being enabled by technology these days. So it is, in many respects, much more easy to infiltrate into sensitive databases and extract valuable intelligence through cyber-enabled means than it ever would have been in the classic, cloak and dagger days of spy agencies. So you have some pretty large and pretty aggressive intelligence services out there who are intent on finding vulnerabilities in the West wherever they can, and extracting what they hope might be valuable information wherever they can. So it's not that foreign intelligence services pick on Canada. It's just that Canada is a valued target because we are seen as a well-developed, high-tech country with access to a lot of secrets, both our own and our allies. And we're also a gateway to the United States. So you can do various forms of cross-border espionage from a Canadian base. So we're kind of inadvertently in the kind of global espionage bullseye, if you like, and that global espionage effort is ceaseless. It's not new to the 21st century, of course, but it's ceaseless, and it's more damaging than ever in terms of really the ability to exfiltrate a huge quantity of data, and the ongoing challenge of trying to uncover foreign intelligence activities. Where the old methods, essentially, the old methods were really based on identifying foreign intelligence officers within foreign state embassies and consulates and missions, trying to identify them as intelligence officers, keep a watch on them, try and figure out who they were interacting with. A lot of that physical activity that opened up surveillance capabilities for you has been obliterated by technological access. So you can have intelligence officers working in embassies who, in a way, never really need to step foot on the street or talk to anybody in person. They just have to get very good at cyber infiltration. So it's a changing world. Espionage is persistent, but espionage is much more capable of doing harm, I think, these days than it ever was in the past.
Thank you. Is there any annual or refresher training undertaken to ensure that holders of security clearances are aware of their responsibilities in terms of security awareness? Do you know what?
Marilyn, I think the answer to that is no. This is true for the federal government. What current officials who undergo security clearances at various levels are informed about is their requirement to report changes in their circumstances, which might be a signal to their vulnerability or willingness to betray. And those changes in circumstances are quite wide-ranging, around financial changes, marital status changes, changes in lifestyle, and so on. So the requirement, on paper at least, is individuals are meant to be, to open themselves up to more scrutiny between those goalposts of security clearances. And then on top of that, managers are under a requirement to be vigilant and report on any sort of changes that they've noticed in the workplace behavior of folk working for them. So it's meant to be that sort of two-part effort. But what is really required at the heart of it is a kind of change in culture, a willingness, if you like to put it overly simply, to distrust your colleagues. And that's a very difficult place to get to.
Right. And what about government IT capability? Would you say it's up to date and capable of detecting, preventing, or recording access to classified material?
I would say it's a race. It's kind of an ongoing race between, if you like, cyber defense and the ability of people to find ways of exploiting the system. I think that the primary responsibility in terms of protection of cyber information under the control of, or information under the control of the federal government, that primary responsibility falls to the Communications Security Establishment, which is a very sophisticated signals intelligence and cybersecurity agency. When they give public talks, they talk about the scale of daily intrusions that they see on government networks. And the figure is mind-blowing. The latest one I heard was that CIC encounters something like 1.2 billion intrusions per day. 1.2 billion per day. Now, many of these intrusions are relatively harmless, but they all have to be monitored. So CIC has essentially a kind of picket system around all federal government information systems to try and detect anomalous or dangerous or rule-breaking intrusions into systems. So I'd say CIC is very good at that game, but it's up against a very formidable enemy. And there are always ways to circumvent it. So, for example, in the Cameron Ordus case, one of the things that we discovered was that Ordus was maintaining a kind of second office for himself in his luxury apartment in Byward Market. And that second office included a bank of high-powered computers that had a lot of encrypted information on them and were using encrypted channels to communicate. So, he was avoiding the defenses by taking himself outside the picket fence, if you like. So there will always be those kinds of things. But CIC is generally regarded by our Five Eyes partners as probably the best cybersecurity agency among the Five Eyes. So that's not a bad tribute, and I have no reason to disbelieve those accolades, which I've heard from Five Eyes officials.
Thank you. Can you speak about disinformation or misinformation to Canadians? Is this an area that's being looked at, and who's doing it and how it's being done?
Sure. So again, Marilyn, it's a great question. It's a source of very large concern, particularly focused on concern, broadly concerned about democratic interference, as it's called, but focused concern in terms of election interference and the potentiality for that in particular. I think the important thing, and much of this is ramped up since 2016 and the revelations of Russian efforts to interfere in the US presidential elections at that time. I think the important distinction that Canadians need to understand is that the federal government, while it takes disinformation and misinformation seriously, has to operate in two different arenas. Where it's comfortable operating, if you like, is in dealing with foreign or state-sponsored disinformation or misinformation impacting on Canada. And so can focus its attention on trying to detect foreign states involved in those kinds of activities. And to try and deter them through various means. And even as a result of recent national security legislation, the Communications Security Establishment has a legal power to engage in proactive or preemptive efforts to deal with those kinds of threats. Essentially, what we might call in common parlance, hacking back. So the federal government could hack back. It's a dangerous tool, potentially escalatory. You have to do it very carefully, but at least that legal power exists. So that there's that state actor environment where we're on guard. More challenging is, in a way, the domestic environment, where disinformation and misinformation may circulate, and where it may not be clear that the circulation has any connection to a foreign state actor. And so that domestic arena becomes very complex because it immediately evokes kind of state intervention in charter rights. And you know, so that is a very complex arena where it's largely fallen to existing hate crime legislation to try and deal with, which is probably not very satisfactory. But I think all I can say, Marilyn, to that very good question is there is an ability to deal and there's a desire to deal with foreign state actors engaged in misinformation and disinformation. There is a lot of thought being given to what to do about domestic disinformation and misinformation. Some of it focused on hate crime legislation, some of it, of course, focused on social media regulation, which is also a very challenging topic. But the two are quite distinct as problem areas.
Thank you. Do you think the federal government is taking the insider threat seriously enough? And if not, what else might be done?
I think the Delisle case, again, very good question. I think the Delisle case was a real shocker in terms of the length of time that Delisle was able to betray secrets, the impact on our allies, the threats that our allies made to us about kind of cleaning up our act. And the Delisle case was really the first major insider threat case to come to Canada that we know about, you know, since the Cold War. So there'd been that kind of interregnum where we hadn't seen a lot of this activity at a very high level. But Delisle, I think, changed thinking, or at least began a process of changing thinking about taking the insider threat more seriously, ramping up counterintelligence capabilities. It's part of an effort to really pivot in new directions in terms of national security protections. And the challenge there, I think, really for the federal government is, and it's a challenge, I think, for public understanding as well, that we've spent a long time post 9/11 being primarily concerned with terrorism as a threat. Even as the terrorism threat changed, evolved, and perhaps became over time less serious, nevertheless, that's been, you know, often talked about as the #1 threat to national security, even when officials in Ottawa knew that it wasn't. So we're pivoting away from that terrorism-focused national security environment to an appreciation that there are many, many new challenges in national security, including the insider threat, that are going to require resources, time, attention devoted to them. And that is a big steering of the aircraft carrier of national security in the Canadian case, and it's still underway.
Thank you. This is the last question. You may not be able to answer it fully. Could you speak to the potential threat of quantum technologies, computers that will break existing encryption and communication technologies that are unhackable?
So thankfully, I can't speak to that. I mean, except that I know that people are focused on this. CIC is focused on this. Private sector tech companies are focused on the promises and perils of quantum computing and what they might mean by what they might mean for previously encrypted data. It's a big problem. I think, thankfully, at least for me, it's probably at least 10 years out. So I'm not going to worry about it for the next 10 years, and maybe by then I won't have to worry about it at all.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Marilyn, and thank you for moderating today. And I wanted to thank you, Wesley, for covering such an extensive amount of ground. We had a ton of questions. We couldn't get to all of them. We did have a very clever question. I think it's a very good question. To what extent are foreign embassies in Canada monitored by the Canadian government? But we won't be able to get to that today.
But to a big extent.
Yeah, and I really thought your comment about the days of spying gone past, the Cambridge Five, and I remember when I was stationed in Turkey and at the British Embassy in Ankara during the Second World War, they had a spy there named Cicero, who stole huge numbers of secrets. But you know, pages like you mentioned, and today the modern spy is sending thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of documents, and it all has to be sifted through, which is another aspect, of course. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating. And I can't thank you enough for expanding our knowledge today on you know, what is the insider threat. And no doubt we're not the only ones who have to contend with this, I would imagine. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for your time today with us. And that was a pretty quick hour, I have to say. And for those of you that are still here with us, and I'm glad to see so many people are still here, we do have some great talks coming up. Our next one will be with Larry Haas out of Washington, D.C., talking about his new book focused on the Kennedy family, talking about America in days gone past, and then bringing it up to the situation that we find the United States in today. So you can find out lots of information about all of our events on the Canadian International Council's national website. So that's it for me. One more time, Marilyn, thank you. And Wesley, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day, everybody.